Hi, my name's Sheehan, and today I'd like to talk about The Complete Mouse by Art Spiegelman. And I'd like to go through this graphic novel exploring the structure of the plot as well as the themes that crop up in this work. Now, Mouse was serialised to begin with, I think starting in 1980, but eventually it took the form of this handsome edition where it's been collected and produced in two parts, which I'll go through in a minute. If you could sum up Mouse in a sentence, it would be something like the survival of a Jewish man against all the odds during the Holocaust. And it's a deeply moving, also rather funny in places as well, story based on the life of Art Spiegelman's father, Vladek Spiegelman. And throughout the book, Vladek is being interviewed by his son Art, or Artie as he's called by his father, about his life during the Holocaust. So there's something rather postmodern, I guess, about the process of Art Spiegelman writing this novel, this graphic novel, being recorded in the actual graphic novel. But it's certainly not done in a pretentious way. It's very effective. And before I begin with the plots, throughout this book, the different peoples, the different races are portrayed as animals very effectively. So for instance, the Jews are portrayed as mice, the Germans are portrayed as cats, the Poles as pigs, the Americans as dogs. You even get a glimpse of the British, who are like fish. It's rather charming, but rather revealing as well, actually, I think. You know, here are some of the images. Really striking. After a very brief cartoon strip introducing Artie as a boy and Vladek, his father, we come to the first part, which is called My Father Bleeds History. And this really tells of Vladek's life prior to the Jewish Holocaust, up until the point where he and his wife are incarcerated at Auschwitz. So we begin with Vladek recalling his girlfriend who was desperately in love with him, but then Vladek fell in love with Anya, who he married. And Anya's family were very wealthy. They owned factories in the hosiery trade, and Anya gives birth to a son, Richu, I think his name is. But then we realise that Anya has got very poor mental health. She suffers a great deal from anxiety and depression. Indeed, we find here that much later on, after the war, she commits suicide. The author's mother, remember, as well. And quite frighteningly, the rise of anti-Semitism in Poland, where they live, is depicted, as well as Nazism, of course. And Vladek going off to fight for the Poles, but then being caught as a prisoner of war. He's eventually released, and he makes a difficult journey back to his family in Sosniewicz. I hope I pronounced that right. Anyway, has this long, difficult journey back there, back to Anya and her family. But now the Nazis really begin to hold sway in Poland, and Jews are being vetted from communities, taken out. The ghetto is formed. It's now extremely dangerous to be Jewish in Poland. And they notice that many of their friends are being taken away, and Vladek and his family start to hide. They're quite successful in hiding from the Nazis, and eventually they manage to leave the ghetto themselves. It's just too dangerous. They find somewhere to stay, and they make a deal with some people smugglers, but they're betrayed, and they end up being taken to Auschwitz. And by this time as well, the children of the extended family, including Rishu, are taken away by another family, and he's never seen again. In fact, he dies tragically. And then part two is called And Here My Troubles Began. And this depicts in a terrifying way the horrors of Auschwitz. Vladek and Anya were separated, but Vladek, through sheer ingenuity and kind of presence of mind, resourcefulness, manages to teach one of the guards English, so he kind of gets a bit of an easier time compared to the others, although it's still horrific. And eventually he manages to see Anya, even in Auschwitz. She's in Birkenau, in another camp nearby. Eventually Vladek's marched out of Auschwitz. He's put on this train from hell. I mean, it's just cramped and people dying in this train. It just sounds awful, beyond awful. And he's taken to Dachau, of all places, out of the frying pan into the fire, as it were. And he contracts typhus in Dachau, which almost kills him. Eventually he leaves Dachau in a train. Him and his fellow travellers realise the war's over. The Germans seem to be retreating and they've kind of left them by this lake, and eventually the Americans find them. And at the end, Vladek is finally reunited with his wife Anya. They make a new life for themselves, first in Sweden and then in New York. So that basically tells the story of this remarkable graphic novel. And remember, it's not just set in the 30s and 40s. It's also set in the kind of late 70s, 80s, while Artie is interviewing his father. So it kind of switches between the two. And Vladek's remarried to this lady called Marla, who they just seem to be arguing all the time. Now, Vladek himself, as an older man, just seems to be incredibly difficult. He's forever putting a guilt trip on his son, saying you should visit me more, why aren't you around more, etc., why aren't you helping your old man, etc. And but he's also incredibly tight with his money. He hoards everything. He's even reluctant to part with a penny, and this drives his new wife Marla to despair, and eventually they separate. He's a very difficult character in many respects. But you can't help liking him, particularly knowing what he's been through. And one of the great things about this work is you realise how you really get why he's like that in old age, because he's been through so much, and you can't blame him for wanting to hoard everything himself. Art doesn't spare us any details about his father as an old man. You know, he's racist as well. He's got it in for black people, and Art is just like, well, how can you be so racist after what you've been through? So it's just it's full of contradictions, full of these rough edges around Vladek's character. Nevertheless, makes him incredibly believable. Of course, he's a real person. And the relationship between Vladek and Artie, although it is strained, deep down is very affectionate, I think, and very touching. And the way Vladek just recalls these terrible things that's happened to him, sometimes in very matter-of-fact ways, is heartbreaking, particularly when he describes the separation from his son, Artie's brother, who he never met, who just died as a kid, and these people who just were treated so abominably around him. I think one of the most telling lines comes from Françoise, who is Artie's partner. I think Artie says something along the lines of, no wonder Vladek's like this after surviving through all this. And Françoise says, perhaps he's like this because he hasn't survived. Perhaps these experiences, these terrible experiences he'd gone through, are kind of slowly killing him, even, today. And he's a man that can't relax, Vladek. He's always on edge. You can't blame him for that after seeing what he's been through. I mean, some of the images, some of the pictures are, wonderful. I mean, the artistry is just really great. Between the words and the images, it's just such a synchronicity, I think. And also the way they talk, particularly Vladek. His syntax is kind of very idiomatic, I guess, of Jewish people of a particular generation, with these, I suppose, Yiddish inflections or whatever. I don't know how to describe that, but it's very charming to read the way Vladek speaks in here. So, Mouse, a book about the Holocaust, man's inhumanity to man, anti-Semitism, racism, but also a lot about survival and the traumas of survival and the effects that can have on one's own soul, but also straining the relationships around them. It's very much a book about family and a sense of guilt as well. But it's just told in such a wonderfully moving and beautiful and human and loving way. So this is a real eye-opener for me. I've not read a graphic novel like this before, and I just thought it was terrific. And as a teacher myself, I'd love to share this with children who will be studying World War II and the Holocaust. Thanks for watching. There's a brief slideshow outlining the structure and the themes of this work. Bye.